Thank you all for joining us. We've got a packed crowd here. Really excited for the speakers to end the day as well. I think everything that we're going to be talking about here really sets the stage for a lot of the conversations that are going to be happening over the next few hours. We've got a pretty limited amount of time, so I want to jump into it. Let's start with intros, and then we'll dig in from there. Colin?
My name is Colin Harper. I'm the editor-in-chief of Blockspace Media. We're a Bitcoin industry publication focused on mining, tech, and kind of few things in between that some of the other crypto publications don't pick up.
I'm Kevin Zhang. I'm SVP of Business Development at Foundry Digital. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Digital Currency Group, and we're best known for our mining services, namely our Bitcoin mining pool. We are the largest Bitcoin mining pool in the world. About 30% of all new Bitcoins, as well as all Bitcoin transactions, flow through our software stack.
Matthew Pines, I'm head of strategy at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I advise policymakers on Bitcoin, focusing on national security, geopolitics. My other hat is I'm a director of intelligence for Pinnacle One Strategic Advisory Group, which is a consulting firm that advises multinationals and critical technology companies on their geopolitical and cybersecurity risk.
And I'm Grant McCarty. I'm the co-executive director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute. So let's jump right into it. I want to talk strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? This has been the talk of the conference so far, both on stage and off. About 12 hours ago, a member of essentially Russia's form of Congress sends a letter to the Central Bank of Russia saying, we need to buy Bitcoin. Multiple countries have already bought Bitcoin and not necessarily announced that. The United States is considering buying Bitcoin. Brazil. Matt, can you walk us through what is a strategic Bitcoin reserve? What's the game theory? What are we seeing playing out right now?
Yeah, so a pretty simple concept. That's a country deciding to hold Bitcoin as a reserve asset, right? So countries hold a wide range of sort of assets in their portfolio. Some are held by the central bank, some by the Ministry of Finance. And so this would essentially just be diversifying the portfolio of assets that countries decide to invest portions of their essentially sovereign savings, right? So pretty simple concept, pretty radical in a sort of historical context. And I think every country is appraising Bitcoin emerging as a geopolitically relevant asset class that's now been validated, now been proven, and has a lot of properties that make it a fair thing to consider for different countries' sovereign reserves. And so I think this is a conversation that has happened relatively quickly. And so I think a lot of countries don't necessarily have the institutional infrastructure, don't have necessarily the dialogue internally to really assess this as a serious policy proposal. But that is happening. It's happening literally as we speak. And so I think this is going to be a theme over the course of the first year of the Trump administration, which they seem poised to take a very proactive and very positive stance towards Bitcoin. And that is likely going to set the tenor and tone for other countries to potentially respond in kind.
So, Colin, I want to jump to you and I think a question on a lot of people's minds here, because there are a lot of people who work in blockchain, who work in crypto, right? Obviously, this conference is Bitcoin MENA. Why are we talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve and not a reserve of all of these other crypto tokens that are out there? What sets Bitcoin apart? Why Bitcoin?
It gets the people going. But yeah, I mean, it's ultimately, there's a lot of kind of cliches to hash out, but it's said a lot. I think it deserves repeating. Bitcoin is digital gold for crypto. It's the most decentralized cryptocurrency in terms of not just allocation of actual coins, but in the way that the consensus mechanism operates, in the way that mining operates. I mean, right now, I think, 750 exahashes currently operating. So just like gigawatts of power are underpinning this network. And it really couldn't be anything else, too, because all of the other coins have founders that are known. They have founders that are currently pretty active in the development of their chains. And so I don't think that you could have this be anything else. And kind of one thing to append to this, just on the whole concept of a Bitcoin reserve, I'm really curious to see if Trump actually has the fight in him to try to push something like that. Because if you listen to his talk at Bitcoin 2024, his promise was to not sell the Bitcoin that the US government currently holds from seizures from things like the Silk Road and other things, which is like 200,000 Bitcoin. It's a lot. It's less than MicroStrategy and less than some of the other companies that are operating in the space. I want to see if he's actually going to make the commitment to what like Cynthia Lummis has said, where it's like we're going to like actively buy millions of dollar blocks of this thing going forward. I think that Trump's presidency is potentially very disruptive in the second term. he promised a more disruptive presidency in his first term, but some of that didn't come to fruition, partly because he said he didn't staff the right people. We'll see. I think that over the next few years, we're going to see how far this dissident streak in him goes. Like, is he going to be able actually to defy the Federal Reserve? Is he going to be able actually to defy the U.S. Department of Treasury and do these things that would honestly would be very antithetical to a lot of what most mainstream economists and thinkers would think, right?
I want to come back to that in a moment. Matt, we'll dig into the mechanics of a strategic Bitcoin reserve in a second. Kevin, really quickly, can you talk about Bitcoin mining essentially underpinning this Bitcoin network? Colin makes the point that mining is one of the reasons why a reserve ultimately makes sense. There's the security budget. It is the most secure, most decentralized cryptocurrency. So talk a little bit about just the mining ecosystem right now, but more importantly, we have strategic Bitcoin reserve, countries buying Bitcoin. What does it mean for countries to be Bitcoin mining superpowers?
Yeah, I absolutely love this topic. I've been in the Bitcoin mining space for over a decade now, primarily in North America. And I want to take a step back and kind of go down memory lane. When I first started building Bitcoin mining sites, you had to first search for large facilities with abundance of power. And this was late 2013, early 2014. When I was reaching out to facilities, I told them I needed a lot of power, I need a cool climate, and I needed a lot of acreage. They said, son, you're not coming in here and building a marijuana farm. I'm like, oh, hold up. It's not for marijuana. It's for Bitcoin mining. Son, you're not going to come in here, mine Bitcoin to buy marijuana. So we've come a long way since those the last decade. And for me, it certainly feels like the Twilight Zone, where it's like now not only is it just like kind of within our own industrial, our own circles, it's talked about at a national level, right? And I think we've hit the key buzzword is infrastructure. Right now, over 60% of all the hash rate, all the Bitcoin mining actually takes place in North America, and that's predominantly in the United States. Our own mining pool, we're based out of the US, out of the great state of New York, which is oftentimes not so great towards Bitcoin. But that's right there geographically in the US. And we process a lot of the transactions. Like I said, if you're 30% of the hash rate, you're processing 30% of all the transactions that happen on chain as well. And I think the signal of a strategic reserve also can be symbolic for bringing back banned businesses, right? I remember getting shut down by numerous various banks. Now they're coming back to us saying, hey, Bitcoin's okay again. We'd love to offer our services to you all again. And then on the other side of the world, when we look at China, they obviously had some very serious guidance where they scared off Bitcoin mining in the summer of 2021. Well, now there's rumblings again that mining farms are turning back on power. China is once again looking at ramping up their own Bitcoin production as well.
So I think a good thematic underpinning for this conversation is this idea of a global Bitcoin race, right? And this race, many would argue, has been going on for a while, right? This idea that countries are going to want to stack as much Bitcoin as possible. They're going to want as much Bitcoin hash rate, meaning as many Bitcoin miners as possible in their territory. So there are, again, two components, strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then there's the mining component. Colin brought up some good points about could President Trump actually establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve in 2025, right? And when I think about this global Bitcoin race, I really look at the acceleration that has taken place since President Trump spoke at Bitcoin Nashville earlier this year. And again, we're seeing everything that I mentioned at the top of this, countries essentially going all in, realizing the race is on. And the US has signaled this is something we want to do in some way, shape, or form. Matt, what does it actually look like? Does President Trump have the ability to buy Bitcoin?
Yeah, so there's an executive branch and a legislative branch. The legislative branch has the power of the purse, and so that fundamentally constrains how much the executive can spend on things that aren't already appropriated. But there are potential tricks up various sleeves. So on the executive side, which is where you would expect more timely action to take place early on in the administration, there's sort of the minimal thing that I would expect that's probably likely, which would be the establishment of something called a strategic Bitcoin reserve that is effectively just drawing a box, metaphorically, around the existing assets held in the U.S. Marshal's account that's custodied by a third party, and basically committing not to sell that and call that the strategic Bitcoin reserve. And essentially, it's mostly like a matter of intent. It's a matter of signaling that the U.S. administration is going to be pro-Bitcoin. But that doesn't necessarily lead to net acquisition of new Bitcoin. to do that without congressional appropriations, there is a reasonable chance that, for example, the 1934 Gold Reserve Act could be used, which has created something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. It's essentially like a slush fund that, at the discretion of the president, specifically his delegee and the Treasury Secretary, to essentially purchase gold, foreign exchange, or other instruments of credit or securities. And so there's a bit of a technicality here where Bitcoin doesn't necessarily fit those definitions, but it's reasonable to me that you could essentially structure a credit instrument with a counterparty that essentially pays out, like redeems a bond in Bitcoin like overnight, right? So, doesn't seem like much of a legal restriction. There's about $40 billion in the Exchange Stabilization Fund. About half of that's already pre-committed. Probably, maybe you could spend 10 to 20 billion, right? Best case scenario. So I think the legal mechanisms are there, the existing funding is there, but again, you're still talking, in the orders of 5, 10, 15 billion dollars. So would be enough to send a very strong signal to the world, and probably would, precipitate other countries taking a serious look at this. But the majority of the sort of strategic level of investment would have to come through congressional appropriation. This is the Senator Lummis bill, which has been introduced, which would commit the United States to purchasing essentially 200,000 Bitcoin a year to achieve a total stockpile of about 1 million after 5 years, sets up all these arrangements for custody, security, et cetera. That, of course, is going to go through a whole process with education and cajoling inside the Senate. So TBD, right, how much, where that will rank on the order of priorities for the new administration, how much political capital is going to be spent on that. So those are kind of the order of likelihood, right? Very likely we'll get something like, a declaration of intent, the creation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, maybe 50-50. We get something like an executive, sponsored purchase, to a limited degree. And then I don't know how to handicap the Senate.
Gotcha. So just to recap there's a policy path forward to the new president in 2025 in the United States buying somewhere between $10, $20 billion worth of Bitcoin, establishing some semblance of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then Congress using that, taking that as the bedrock, and then passing legislation to buy Bitcoin. So again, two prongs of this: strategic Bitcoin reserve, and then mining. And then the third that we have touched on is this idea of the broader Bitcoin industry, right? And kind of opening your country up for business, right? Saying we are supportive of innovation. We want Bitcoin businesses here. Kevin, one of the things that you talked about was this idea of law-abiding businesses being debanked, right? And the idea of it just being very hard to be a Bitcoin business for the last few years. When we think about trends that we could see moving forward, you can see ultimately, more friendly environment for business, both in the U.S., but obviously we're in Abu Dhabi right now. There seems to be, in some ways, this. There's been a discussion of essentially a business arbitrage, right? Do you go where the regulatory environment is as friendly as possible? So, Kevin, could you maybe talk about how that impacts the mining industry specifically? Where are miners going to go? Why are they going to choose specific countries, regions, or places to mine Bitcoin?
I think it's a great question. So there's a gentleman sitting in the front row. He's got a hat on that says Texas in very big letters. And we go to Texas quite often because the infrastructure is there. The administration will only be in power, Trump's administration will be in for 4 years. And it takes much longer than 4 years to build transmission lines, distribution systems, these major substations. So going through all these different processes, that takes years and years and years. Not only that, the U.S. is a republic. It's got 50 plus states, right? And they all kind of moderate and regulate their own states independently. Like I mentioned before, that we're based in New York. Even though we run one of the biggest Bitcoin software layers on Bitcoin, they kicked us out when it comes to mining, right? So that's why you go to states that are, one, business friendly, but also have an abundance and infrastructure is ready for you to build your Bitcoin mining projects. This is in particular with, obviously, with the lens of just Bitcoin mining.
Now, Colin, maybe you could talk about it from potentially a banking perspective, right? You've been covering this industry for a while. You've been looking at all the different companies, where they've been domiciled, where they've done business. What are some trends that you've seen over the past few years in terms of Bitcoin industry, where they're going, and what do you see as potential opportunities maybe in this region specifically?
Well, within this region specifically, there's been a lot of interest in Bitcoin mining, obviously, in like the UAE. Oman is another place that's been brought up a lot in conversations this week. Saudi Arabia is entering the conversation, but it's nothing near what we have in the UAE. I believe like the UAE, from estimates from some miners, they say it's anywhere from 800 megawatts to a gigawatt of mining capacity here. Oman, much smaller, under 100 megawatts. Looking back to the U.S. in particular, the U.S. historically within the Bitcoin ecosystem has been a financial capital for exchanges, for movements of capital, for investment. And it wasn't until 2021, during the China mining ban, where provincial Chinese provinces were restricting Bitcoin mining one by one, that you saw the axis of influence for mining shift to the U.S. as well. I think that's probably been one of the biggest changes over the last few years. With regards to financial plumbing in the U.S., I think one of the biggest benefits of a Trump presidency versus a Kamala presidency is the fact that under Biden, you had this Operation Choke Point 2.0, which is an informal moniker coined by Nick Carter. He reported on this in Pirate Wires. I recommend anyone in the audience who's interested about it to go read up on it. But you basically had this systemic effort from regulators under the Biden administration to debank and to cut off certain crypto banks like Silvergate from the rest of the financial ecosystem, disrupted financial plumbing, put a lot of different crypto companies and startups at risks. They couldn't make payroll, and it was this very covert operation to try to starve out the industry. I think that one of the biggest wins of the Trump presidency is, at the very least, we should not expect to see that level of hostility. We should expect to see a more friendly approach to this, and at least, even if it's not friendly, just not messing with this industry, right? Like the Biden administration was openly hostile, and I think that Choke Point 2.0 is just the crystallization of that. The one last thing I'll say, kind of piggyback off of some of Kevin's comments about mining, another big win for Bitcoin interest in the U.S. from a company side is Trump's going to be much more pro-energy. He's talking about restarting the Keystone Pipeline to Canada. If you look at a map on the EIA, the Energy Information Agency in the U.S., U.S. electricity capacity plateaus starting in the 2000s because we started decommissioning coal and we started rolling out solar and wind. I think solar has its place. I'm not as sold as wind, but we have not been serious about energy policy. And Kevin was just talking about how a lot of these things in terms of setting up the infrastructure for these power assets takes a long time. I'm hoping that the Trump presidency will get more serious about building out nuclear at scale, about drilling for natural gas and oil, about doing things that we need to do to set ourselves up for success 10, 20 years from now. And if he does that, you're going to see, I think, the mining industry in the U.S. be much stickier than it otherwise would be if we did not have serious energy policy.
So you touched on my closing question here. We got a couple minutes. And the question is essentially to anybody in the audience, right, whether they're in U.S. government or otherwise, or different governments maybe in this region, what is your recommendation if they want to be pro-Bitcoin, if they want capital from Bitcoin companies and miners to flow to them, if they want energy companies to realize, hey, we can mine Bitcoin? Kevin, what is your recommendation? Maybe it's one thing, maybe it's two, to somebody on a policy front who wants to be open for business with regard to Bitcoin?
I think it's pretty simple. Just open the communication channels, and I think it's already beginning. Some of the rhetoric and some of the arguments the New York State had for closing down some of our mining operations was that the whirling of the Bitcoin mining fans were scaling away killer whales in the ocean, which made no sense, right? So I think just actually being able to talk to the businesses, figuring out what their needs are, what their pain points are, oftentimes the regulators are addressing completely the wrong topics, right? So I think just opening the communication channels, that's a big step in the right direction.
Now, Matt, close us out here from a policy perspective. Title of this panel, Bitcoin in the Age of Trump. What would you like to see in 2025 from a policy perspective in the new U.S. administration? What's feasible, and what do you think ultimately is going to allow the United States, but the entire world, to benefit from Bitcoin?
So the incoming economic team, Secretary Designee Scott Bessent for the Treasury Department, he's made it very clear that he wants to shepherd essentially what he called a global economic reordering that might include a sort of monetary reset. So they have large structural, geopolitical, and monetary ambitions for basically the first 12 months of the presidency. So I would expect pretty dramatic changes, a lot of wielding of kind of elements of geoeconomic statecraft to reset the terms of global trade, the monetary system in directions that they think favor U.S. national security interests. So folks in this region will have to kind of posture and adapt to that. On the Bitcoin side, I would like to see the U.S. government think about more creative ways of leveraging, if they do create a strategic Bitcoin reserve, actually leveraging it in a smart fashion. For example, you could take 10 or 20% of it, use it as seed capital in like a Bitcoin wealth fund, and use that, bring in private investment, leverage it up, turn 10, 20 billion into 100 billion, and actually use that to invest in strategic projects, emerging critical technology, try to fill the gaps in sort of, advanced R&D, and, use this as like an accelerant for technological development, right? So I think this is where you also bring together other constituencies inside the United States government that otherwise may not be that positively disposed to Bitcoin, but you put them into a position where their interests, say, in technological competition, advanced development, are now aligned positively with Bitcoin, right? So I think finding creative ways to sort of structurally align other stakeholders in the system with Bitcoin, that's how you have smart policy.
The Bitcoin race is on. The new Trump administration has accelerated it, and if you want to win, it starts with good policy. Thank you all.
Is your company ready for the next evolution in financial strategy? Bitcoin for Corporations is your partner in securing the future of your business. With exclusive membership benefits, our comprehensive masterclass, and a network of trusted service providers, we provide the insights and resources to help you incorporate Bitcoin into your financial strategy, ensuring stability and long-term value. Strengthen your business. Innovate with confidence. Bitcoin for Corporations, protecting your treasury and positioning you for the future.